Salutations, my name is Summer, and this is Cozy Reading with Quaker Cats, and I want to talk about Mudbound by Hillary Jordan. I'm sorry there's going to be spoilers, because when I get into it, I just get into it. So, also, I want to say there's every single type of trigger in here, so if you're sensitive to that, I wouldn't watch this because I'm going to talk about it. I'm not going to use any Like I'm not going to, if I read anything out, I won't be using any racial slurs, which are in here, or any cuss words or anything like that, just because I don't feel comfortable reading, saying those things. So I'll switch the words around if I read something that has those in there. But besides that, yeah, there's a lot of ugliness in here about the war, about racism. And I think that's very important because a lot of authors tiptoe around what really happened in so many ways. And I understand that. But if you're reading an adult book, I feel like it's important to have those things when they happened because otherwise it doesn't seem that bad. You know, it's like when you're reading about the Holocaust and they are just tiptoeing around saying, oh, well, then the Americans came and saved him and they got him out and they gave him food and clothing. No, that is not how it was. You can't do that to people and everything be okay, like they're saved and now they're not dying because you're feeding them, or it's just the beginning of, anyway. So yeah, that's a long thing. I just feel like it's important to say things that sometimes are ugly or dirty, nitty gritty, um, because it's real. It really happened. And this book isn't. It is graphic, but it's not like it's. I don't know. Anyway, let me just get on with this. So, Mudbound by Hillary Jordan. This is um, her debut novel. I just can't believe it. I watched this as a movie about 4 years ago. It won a lot of awards, which I don't care about awards, but it deserves every one of them that it's won. It's a full circle story. So you start with Henry and Jamie, who are brothers, and they're 19 years apart. Henry's the oldest in the family, and Jamie's the youngest. And 19 years apart, their outlook on life is way different with how they were raised, even though they were both raised with their horrible father. So it starts out the very beginning of the book where they're digging a hole to bury their father. 1940s Mississippi. A Mudbound comes from a farm that Henry ends up buying, and it's called Fairfields, and his wife Laura calls it Mudbound. Okay, so let me tell you about, let me read this actually to you about the beginning, what it says. This is not the beginning, this is page 13. But I must start at the beginning if I can find it. Beginnings are elusive things. Just when you think you have hold of one, you look back and see another earlier beginning and an earlier one before that. So, and I've noticed that I have been having a hard time thinking about how to even start this, talking about it. But I want to tell you about the people. So, okay, so we have Jamie. I told you about him. Jamie is the youngest son. Henry is the oldest son of a family. And Henry had went off to war earlier and he came back with a limp. And Jamie went off to World War II and he became a pilot. So he flew in the war. So we got Henry and Jamie. We have Laura. And I'll show you how these are set up. Each chapter, like this one, is going into Florence. Each chapter gives you that perspective of the character, and I love it when books do that. So Laura is like in her 30s, and she came from a well-to-do family. She went to college. She was 31 when she met Henry, when Henry started coming around, and she was raised very plain. She had sisters that are beautiful, but for her, she was plain, and she just never felt like she just felt like she was going to be a spinster her whole life. So when Henry started coming around, she was very flattered by his attention that she had never had before, and it wasn't love at first sight or anything like that, but it was enough for her to say, he seems like a kind man. I'd like to have a family and start a life with him. So she ends up marrying Henry, and they end up having two daughters. Well, Henry, one of his sisters, her husband ends up committing suicide. So Henry now has to take care of his sister and her children and his father, who was living with the sister. So he has to, and Henry has always wanted to be a farmer, but he never told Laura this. Laura had just assumed, he went to college, she went to college. They were going to have a life in town. He was going to go off to work. She was going to take care of the family. Just basic, living. But Henry has had ideas in his head since he was 6 years old. His grandfather was a farmer, and on his deathbed, he had talked about how important the land is. Because Henry's father didn't care. He hated the dirt. He was such a but. If you could not find a worse character than Henry's father, and now that Henry's sister, he has to take care of her. He sets her up in a house. Thank goodness that Laura doesn't have to deal with her also. But he ends up taking him in, and so he goes and he buys this farm, and the farm is just like, it's not livable. There's not like a farmhouse. So Henry ends up renting a house in town for Laura and the girls and his father, and he'll just drive off to the farm to work. So he just tells her all of a sudden, like, hey, we're moving. I bought this land in Mississippi. And she's like, I mean, she has no say. It's like, do I I don't want to make him feel bad. I'm supposed to support him. That's what wives do. So she says, okay, like, I didn't know this. And they go down. So they take up half of what they own because they can't take everything at once. But they drive down, and once they pull into the drive of the house in town that they're renting, this man comes out, and he says, what are you doing here? And Henry said, oh, I'm Henry. I'm renting this. My family, we're renting this place. And the man says, no, I just bought this place. Here's the title. And Henry had just shook on it. He didn't get any kind of paperwork or receipt or anything that he had given this man $100 to rent the place. And I want to read to you Laura's reaction, just to show you what type of person she is. If he had just signed a lease, I thought. If he were just a different sort of man. Henry was never good at reading people. He always assumed everybody was just like him, that they said what they meant and would do what they said. When the door opened, I didn't turn around. He walked up behind me and laid his hand on my shoulder. I hesitated. Then I reached up and touched it with my own. The skin on top was soft and papery. I felt a rush of tenderness for him, for his aging hands and his wounded pride. He kissed the top of my head, and I sighed and leaned into him. How could I wish him to be other than he was, to be hard and suspicious like his father? I couldn't, and I felt ashamed of myself for having had such thoughts. So luckily, the family that had bought the home allowed them to stay the night there, and fed them and their daughters. And then the next morning, they set off to the farm because there is no place else in town that they can rent. When they get to the farm, which is called Fairfields, and Laura names it Mudbound, it's not livable in that sense. It's a working farm, but the little house on it, there's no screens in the windows. The elements, the animals have all been in it. It's just, there's no running water, there's no bathroom, there's an outhouse outside. It's that type of living. And so it's such of a huge like culture shock, in a sense of, you get used to a certain standard of living, and now you are living in a totally different way. And I have I wanted you to hear what she had said about it. And this gives to show you a little bit about the father-in-law and what Laura has to deal with. So when they show up, it's like, where is everybody going to sleep? It's Laura and Henry and their two daughters, and then Pap, Henry's father. And there's Laura and Henry, they said, well, you can sleep in the lean-to. And he said, I'm not sleeping out there. He said, if you got rid of that piano, we could put a bed there. We could, Henry agreed. No, I said, we need the piano. I'm teaching the girls to play. You know that. Besides, I don't want a bed in the middle of the living room. We could rig up a curtain around it, Pappy said. True, Henry said. They were both looking at me, Henry unhappily, his father wearing a smirk. Henry was going to agree. I could see it in his face, and so could Pappy. I need to speak to you in private, I said, looking at Henry. I went out onto the front porch. Henry followed, shutting the door behind him. In a low voice, I said, when you told me you were bringing me here, away from my people and everything I've ever known, I didn't say a word. When you informed me your father was coming to live with us, I went along. When Orr Stokes stood there and told you you had been fleeced by a man you rented the house from, I kept my mouth shut. But I'm telling you now, Henry, we're not getting rid of that piano. It's the one civilized thing in this place, and I want it for the girls and myself, and we're keeping it. So you can just go back in there and tell your father he can sleep in the lean-to. Either that or he can sleep in bed with you, because I am not staying here without my piano. Henry was looking at me like I just sprouted antlers. I stared back, resisting the urge to drop my gaze. So that shows you a little bit about Laura and now the living situation that they're in. Henry, in buying this farm, he became a landlord. So he owns two small houses outside of the farm. Both of them are working farms also. One of them is by a family called, I forget their last name, but Hap and Florence live there. And they are a black couple, and they're farming the land. In the other one, oh, I forget the name of the white couple. Isn't that horrible? I forget the name of the white man, but his wife's name is Vera. And both of them have children. So Hap is doing work for Henry, but the other guy, the white guy, him and his family are not. So we have Hap and Florence and their son Ronzel, who is a huge part of this book. And he is off to war when we start out. So Hap is a religious man. And he just, he was raised in Mississippi. He knows all the rules of how to get along. And his wife, Florence, is a midwife. And the same, I believe Florence was raised in Mississippi too. And they don't know anything besides how they were raised and how everyone in town, how they've always been treated. And I've noticed with racism in this book, the white people seem to be racist because through ignorance, and that's how it's always been. And the black people seem to be racist from experience, which speaks very loudly. So, and how they've been treated. And that's one thing I want to say. Besides Pappy, and there's a couple of side men characters, all the characters that you hear from, I enjoyed so much. I enjoyed hearing their stories. Okay, so anyway, Hap. Hap is a religious man. He's husband to Florence, father to Ronzel. There's a couple of other children that they have. And Florence is a strong woman. Like I said, she's a midwife. And how she even meets Laura. Oh, and there's a difference too. Hap always promised Florence that she'd never have to work the fields. And that was something that was really important to him, that he wanted to take care of that and have her just work in the house. Well, as soon as Henry and Laura move into their, which is like a lean-to, also the house that's not that really livable, their daughters get really sick. And they're really young. I want to say 3 and 5 or something like that. And so she freaks out. They had a huge rain that night. She freaks out. She says, go to the doctor. It's whooping cough. Henry tries to go, but the rains have just washed everything out and he can't get to town. So he drives over to Hap's place and asks if Florence will come, because he had heard she was a midwife, so he figures that she would know something about taking care of children. So Florence comes. But here's the thing about race. Here's where some racism comes up. So he's asks Hap, and Hap goes straight to Florence. Like, I'm not speaking for my wife. You got to ask her. So he goes and he asks her, and she says, well, what are their symptoms? When did they start? And he said, they started last night. And she said, well, I can't come with you because I will bring it home to my children. I have to think about my children's safety. She said, but I can give you some concoctions, or I can give you some medicine to take and tell you what to do. And he's like, I'll pay you, blah, blah, blah. My wife, she's just so upset. Will you please come? And he talks her into coming. And that's something that is in that entitlement of my family's more important. It doesn't matter that you'll get your kids sick. My kids need your help. So Florence goes and she tells, she sets the kids and everybody up and says, I'll be gone for 3 days, And so she goes and she helps Laura. And that's how their relationship starts. She ends up having to stay, of course, because she's not going to go and get her own children sick. And, Pappy, he's so horrible. He treats her like a slave, and he does it in this, he's just so horrible about everything. But he'll be like, go get me some water. And Laura comes in like, excuse me, you have water. There's a pitcher right there beside you. And he's like, I want her to get it. I told her to. It's just that whole thing where you just want to knock somebody out. But okay, so Florence. Now let's talk about Ronzel, their son. Ronzel, he goes off to war. And there is, I wish I could find it. I've flipped through here but when he goes off to war and he goes to England, he says something about the white people, they look at him, but when they look at him, they don't have hate in their eyes. And that's the difference. He's looked at, but they don't carry that hate like they do in the South, where he's from, Mississippi. And I thought, that's powerful. Okay, So Ronzel is, this is one thing, they address the racism in the army, which is so important because people act like, oh no, they're all together and working together, and well, they have to work together, but they don't usually talk about how many were beaten up and killed by their own people, in the army. So Ronzel is in a class, he gets sent in a group of tankers, and they're the first black tankers in the American Army. And they call themselves 761, what? Black Panthers? Yeah, the 761st Black Panther Battalion. And they also, here's one thing also about, because Jamie and Ronzel are both in World War II. And so to hear both of their sides of certain, how they were treated and just their experience with it. For some reason, Jamie's experiences don't stick out like Ronzel's experiences stick out to me. But yeah, Ronzel had talked about how in the tanks, he, when they're in battle, there's no place to go to the bathroom. That he talks about this one guy who was in charge of the missile launcher or whatever, and he was having diarrhea, and when he took his hat and was having diarrhea in his hat, and they were all trapped in this tank with the smell, thinking the smell's gonna kill us before. And I'm thinking, yeah, nobody ever talks about those kinds of things. Same thing with Jamie. He was a pilot. He talks about how cold it gets up there and that he had to pee, and he went and he peed in his hat, and then he forgot that he had set the hat down below or beside him, and he forgot all about it. And then once the battle started, he threw that hat back on top of his head, and all of a sudden, after a few minutes, urine starts leaking down. He's like, oh, here I have urine all over my head. So I thought that was interesting that they had addressed that. Ronzel has a totally different experience in England and in Germany with how he's treated by people from there, not his own people, but the people from there. He has white women he goes to dances, and he has white women wanting to dance with him, and he's freaked out thinking that he could be killed for this, because in the South he could be killed for that, and there he's not, so he can have fun with with whoever he wants when they are not fighting, and they're in different cities and stuff. So you have that. There is something that happens with Ronzel. Well, there's tons that happens with Ronzel that I'm not going to talk about, but there is an experience that happens with Ronzel where I had talked about. He comes across a concentration camp, and I've never read in a book this much graphic about it. So, trigger warning for those of you. So yeah, him and his group, I think they accidentally come across. They're in Germany fighting, and for 6 months in a row they have been fighting. So they're exhausted and a little crazy themselves, but they come across this camp. Hundreds of people, if you can call skin scraped over a pile of bones a person, came staggering out of there. Their heads were shaved, and they were filthy and covered with sores. Some of them ran off down the road, but most of them were just walking around in a daze. Then they caught sight of this dead horse that had been hit by a shell. It was like watching ants on a watermelon rind. They swarmed the carcass, ripping off pieces of it and eating them. It was horrible to see. Horrible. I heard one of the guys retching beside me. We followed the sound of gunshots to this big barn-like building. It was on fire, and I could smell roasting flesh. We came around the corner and seen more SS soldiers shooting at people inside. The building was full of bodies, stacked 6 foot high. one on top of another, smoking and burning. Some of them were still alive, and they were crawling over the dead ones trying to get out. The SS soldiers were standing there, just as calm as they could be, shooting anything that moved. We opened fire. He used other language. Some of them ran, and we got out the tanks and chased them down and shot them. I took out two myself, shooting them in the back as they were running away from me, and I felt nothing but glad. I was walking back to my tank when a woman tottered over to me with her hand stretched out towards me. She had on a ragged striped shirt, but she was naked from the waist down. That was the only way I could tell she was a woman. Her eyes were sunk way back in the sockets, and she had sores all over her legs. She looked like a walking corpse. I started backing away from her, but I stepped in a hole and fell, and then she was on me, clutching me, jabbering nonstop to whatever language she spoke, in whatever language she spoke. I was pushing her away, yelling at her to get off of me, when all the strength seemed to go out of her and she went limp. I lay there underneath her and stared up at the sky, such a pale, pretty blue, like nothing bad had ever happened underneath it or ever could happen. Her weight on me was light as a blanket, so light she was hardly there at all. But then I felt the warmth of her body through my uniform. I ain't never been so ashamed of myself. It wasn't her fault if she seemed less than human. It was the fault of them that had done this to her, and them that didn't raise a voice against it. So he sits up and he helps her sit up, and he remembers he has a candy bar in his bag. So he ends up giving it to her. And of course, here she's been starved all this time, and she cannot, her body can't handle it. And she ends up having having an attack and dying. And all of a sudden, one of his army buddies come running and yelling his name. I looked through the stick-thin legs of the prisoners and seen Sam walking towards me, tears running down his face. Medic says not to feed them, he said. Says it can kill them since they ain't eaten in so long. I looked back down at her, the woman I had just killed with a chocolate bar. I wondered what her name was and who her people were. I wondered whether anybody ever held her like I was doing, whether anybody ever stroked her hair. I hoped somebody did before she came to this place. So, this book, it has other things, other moments like that where it just, you just know these things happen. I mean, if you read any of the history, these things really happen. And for her to put them, I feel like, it was very important that she added these experiences in to the book. Laura, so when it comes, I feel like, the racism was very important too, because Laura, Hap ends up breaking his leg, and they go and they get the doctor, and the doctor is racist, and he sets it wrong. And Laura goes to check on Florence because Florence hasn't been coming to work. Flora ends up working for her, of course. And she ends up not being able to work for her because Hap has broke his leg. So the doctor sets it wrong. She goes to check. It's getting worse. So Florence says, and also Florence wants them to, how Hap broke his leg. I'm sorry, I'm just talking circles. Hap broke his leg. Everything happened at once. His fire, or his barn, something happened to it. I don't think it caught fire. I think it fell in and killed his mule. And then he was trying to fix something and he broke his leg. So everything happened at once. So he can't work his fields and get the seed in time. And so, which means he's going to have to pay Henry to borrow Henry's mule in order to get the seed in. And Laura's like, why don't we just let him borrow the mule? And Henry's like, no, they're going to have to pay us for that. And that just shows the difference. But also, Laura goes, Henry says, here's some money. Go buy you and the girls some dresses. And instead, Laura goes to a different town to get a doctor for Hap. And it's a Jewish doctor. And so that comes in, that is so important too, that he's Jewish, because most doctors won't even see the black people, like won't. And like I said, this doctor, he made sure that he did it painfully and he said it wrong. So actually, Laura going and getting that doctor saves Hap's life because he would have died like blood poisoning or something. So Laura does that. Let's see. And I love Hap and Florence. And, I love all the main characters that we have. Ronzo comes back from the war. Him and Jamie become somewhat friends, even though that race line is always there. I don't really want to tell you everything that happens because if you do read this, I want you to have some surprises. But I will tell you that Laura ends up having this infatuation with Jamie, but everybody does. And there was something that I wanted to share about, oh no, I'll share something horrible first. So the white couple that live on one side of the farm that Henry owns, he is a drinker and he's violent, and he ends up going crazy one night because his horse gets into his tobacco, and so he goes and he shoots the horse in the middle of the night, shooting everywhere, going crazy. And so they're like, we're gonna have to put him off the farm. Like he's too dangerous. Well, the next morning, his wife comes, who is so pregnant, and she has two other girls. And one of the older girl, who I think is 14, is pregnant herself. Anyway, she comes begging, please don't put us off, at least until after whatever time, so that, they can get some kind of notice. So they end up not putting him off, even though they feel like they should, because he's just not a safe person to have around. Well, Vera is her name. I forget his name, but Vera is the woman's name. And her daughter gives birth, and she gives birth around the same time. But the baby dies. I think both babies die. And you don't really hear much from them until Laura is outside and she sees Vera stumbling towards her. And she's got a big butcher knife in her hand. And she's like, I need you to take me to town because I'm going to kill him. I forget his name, but she's going to kill her husband. And Laura is not raised to be around like this kind of, like what in the world is going on? And then she said, this woman has been beat. I don't know if he beats the daughters, probably, but why she's going to town, she wants a ride to town to kill him, is because her 14-year-old daughter, the baby was her husband's. She said he's getting at her, and Laura has no idea what she's talking about. But she said, yeah, every time he would take her out hunting, she would come back and she wouldn't eat, and she was like a ghost. And when she found out that the girl was pregnant, she said, tell me who the father is. And she even beat her with a switch, and the daughter wouldn't tell her who it was. And She knew. She just knew that he was the one who had done it. And when that baby, when the girl had her baby, she went in there and she suffocated it. The mother, Vera, because it was a girl, and she was like, I knew it was his. He can only have girls. And so she went in there and she suffocated the baby, and she suffocated her own baby when it came out. And the older girl went away. I don't know if they married her off. I don't know what happened, but now he's at the younger girl. And he went and he took her out hunting and came back and she wouldn't eat. And she's like, oh, I know, he's getting to her. And so she ends up going and killing him, which she doesn't get any help from Laura. And this is where I'm very unquakerish. Like, I'd be like, I will take you. But it says Carl, his name was Carl. They found Carl's body lying in the road halfway between the farm and town. Vera had stabbed him 17 times, then gone on to Marietta and turned herself into the sheriff, Tacker. Rose and Bill saw her walking down Main Street. They said she was covered in blood like she had bathed in it. And it's just like, what did he expect? You know, that's that entitlement of thinking you own your family, you can do anything you want with them. And a woman, that's one thing I love. You know, there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of, sexist, um, but there's a lot of women taking power in this book also. And there's one more thing I want to share with you, and it's about Jamie. Oh, I wanted to share that too, but it's like 40 minutes. Um, but I want to tell you about Jamie and Laura, her feelings for Jamie. I fell in love with my brother-in-law the way you fall asleep in the car when someone you trust is driving. Gradually, by imperceptible degrees, letting the motion lull your eyes closed. Letting, that's the key word. I could have stopped myself. I could have shoved those feelings into some dark corner of my mind and locked them away, as I'd done with so many other feelings I'd found troubling. I tried to for a time, but it was a half-hearted effort at best, doomed to failure. And then she says later, I want to make one thing clear. When I say that Jamie set about making me love him, I don't mean that he seduced me. Oh, he flirted with me plenty, but he flirted with everybody, even the men. He liked to win people. That makes it sound like a game, and perhaps to a certain type of man it is. But Jamie was no rake. He needed to win them. I didn't see that then. I only saw the way he leaned forward when I spoke, his head cocked lightly to one side, as if to better catch my words. I saw the wildflowers he left me in a milk bottle on the kitchen table, and the happy smiles of my children when he teased them. So it tells about, the complications of relationships. And here's something I want to share about Jamie, what he says. The Bible is full of thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not kill. That's one. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. That's two. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. 3 and 4. Notice how none of them have loopholes. There are no dependent clauses you can hang your sins on, like, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife unless thou art wandering in the blackest hell, lost to yourself, to every memory of light and goodness, and uncovering her nakedness is the only way to back to yourself. No, the Bible's absolute when it comes to most things. It's why I don't believe in God. Sometimes it's necessary to do wrong. Sometimes it's the only way to make things right. And that's one thing it says on the back. Sometimes it's necessary to do wrong. Sometimes it's the only way to make things right. And on the front, Barbara Kingsolver says, "This is storytelling at the height of its powers." Hillary Jordan writes with the force of a Delta storm. So there's a ton I left out. There's a ton of spoilers I left out. I mean, I know I told you so much, and we're going on 40 minutes of just mine rambling, and I don't think anybody will watch this. But I've had fun talking about it, and I really wish I would have done it in a buddy read because I would have loved to talk about so much more in this book. If you've read it, let me know. Sorry this video was so long. And then I just rambled on and on. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope everybody has a great day. Bye.